Hi, I'm Anntanette Nelson, and the book that I read was called The Moon is Broken, A Mother's True Story by Eleanor Craig. I'm sure when you think of a person having AIDS, you think about them getting the disease sexually. You may also picture them having bad hygiene, being poor, or being unintelligent. At least that's always what I pictured and thought. Those aren't necessarily correct assumptions, though. Anyone can get AIDS, and it doesn't matter the ethnicity, gender, religion, or how poor or rich someone is, etc. AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome and is the final stage of HIV disease. It causes severe damage to the immune system. It can be spread by sexual contact, including orally, through blood, like blood transfusions or shared needles, or from mother to child, like breastfeeding or a pregnancy. There are other ways as well, but they are rare. This book is about a mother, which is Eleanor Craig, losing her daughter Annie or Anne Craig to AIDS, and the struggles between them. This book at first is in Connecticut, and Anne is in college at Brown University in Rhode Island. She called her mom, and she was a senior in college, and told her mom that she had to stay to finish up some stuff. And Eleanor saw one of her classmates in Connecticut at a market and asked about Annie, and he said they had already finished up their exams, so she knew Annie was lying. And then she called Annie, and then Annie just lied, and so Eleanor went to visit her and found out that Annie couldn't finish her senior thesis paper and was having troubles and some anxiety over that. When Annie was little, she was involved in theater and loved that, and she wanted to always be an anthropologist and go to Africa. She was very dramatic and caring, and she would help anybody. She was never mean or anything, and always very close to her family. But just before her graduation, she got in trouble for possession of marijuana and said it wasn't her fault. And then she started hanging out with hippies before that, and that was probably some of her trouble, just being friends with the wrong crowd. Now I'm going back to when Annie was in college. After she couldn't get her paper done, she started to cut herself because she felt it was a weakness, and she saw it as a solution to her problem. And then she went to get help at Austin Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. She told her mom she could be there for up to a year, and that wasn't a good thing for her family because they weren't used to being apart for that long. Eleanor felt that Anne just wanted to be hospitalized because she didn't want to take responsibility for anything, especially her paper. And then when Annie went back home, Eleanor finally began to realize that Anne wasn't eating and forcing foods on her family by making a lot of different things with baby food consistency. But she wasn't even eating the foods in front of her parents, so that's how they knew. And then one time on the way, or when Eleanor was taking Annie back to the hospital in Stockbridge, she was speeding, and Eleanor told the officer that she was rushing her daughter to a mental hospital in Stockbridge, and Annie was making noises and acting like she was very mental. They laughed about that incident, but I didn't think it was funny because if she truly wanted to help herself, jokes they shouldn't have been made about her condition. And then throughout the story, Anne is just very manipulative and wanting attention from her mom. She kept on calling her mom throughout the book and telling her she wanted help, but everywhere she went, she would just relapse after that and do the same things as she always had been, like cutting herself or doing drugs. She went to places like Yale, obviously Stockbridge, Silver Hill Hospital, and then finally a drug rehabilitation center. None of them really helped, but some of them started making her eat, and then she forgot about her other problems. But, and then at a certain point, Anne, when she was out on her own, she met a couple of friends and started up her own club called the Pyramid Club as a coming together place where unknown performers, new bands, and filmmakers would exhibit their talents. Anne was very successful there, and Eleanor and Paul had watched her perform and thought she was doing wonderful. Paul was her stepdad because her and Eleanor and Bill, Anne's real dad, had gotten a divorce throughout that whole thing, so that kind of made things worse for Annie as well. And then that is where Annie started getting into major drugs like heroin and still doing pot, and then that's where some of her major problems started as well. At one point, Anne came home before Christmas and said she couldn't stay on Christmas because she needed methadone, and that was to keep her from staying off of heroin. And then Eleanor took Anne back to New York to get it, but by the time they got to the hospital, it was closed. Anne knew she was there. She was to be there by noon and failed. Then Anne told her mom the only way she would go back home for Christmas was if she got some drugs. Eleanor gave in because she wanted Anne home over the holiday. Later, Eleanor felt really bad and knew she shouldn't have done it, but she wanted Anne home with the whole entire family and didn't want her daughter to be alone. And for any mother, that would be super hard, and I would have probably done the same thing in that situation. After that, that's when Anne went to the inner city drug rehab center in New York. And then later, Anne decided she did not want to be hospitalized anymore, and Eleanor was beginning to realize Anne would never be the same. Then, as a last resort, Eleanor and Paul called a Dr. Evans who treated AIDS. Anne refused to see him at first, but she finally agreed. She didn't think she had AIDS, and she was very furious at her mom that she thought that she had AIDS. But in the end, it turned out that she did have AIDS, and she did seek treatment, but she didn't want her mom to see her in those conditions, so she didn't. She told the hospital that she didn't want her mom to come see her, and even told her friends that if her mom called them, that they weren't supposed to tell her anything. Anne was only in her 30s when she died, and Eleanor decided to write the book because it was really hard for her to see Anne going through her struggles, and she was so close to her and tried to help her, and Anne was such a bright young girl, and she always wanted to be successful, but she just couldn't. And at the end, also, Eleanor finds out that probably the main reason why Anne had so many problems is because she was raped. One of Anne's friends told Eleanor that, and Eleanor felt horrible that Anne never told her, because that could have probably solved some of the problems or even saved her life.